Conversation with Malavika Banerjee. This is a Z5 session. Quick lines of introduction. Padma Vibhushan Ruskin Bond is as loved as he is venerated. I do not think anybody here needs a list of what he's done, achieved, or meant to any of us at all. So I shall just ask Malavika, who is director of Kalam and a voracious reader with a special interest in crime fiction, to come up on stage. Do. Over to you, Malavika.
Thank you, Shukonna. Good afternoon, everybody. So this is the third year running. At this time, at this venue, we've had Ruskin Bond, because I'm always very apprehensive that it's a Republic Day. People would have had a lavish lunch, and they would like to take a little siesta. So the only person who they'll wake up or just run from lunch for is Ruskin Bond. So a huge applause for yourselves.
Thank you. Well, I didn't have lunch actually because I had such a big breakfast. So I put off lunch. But the wonderful thing about Kolkata this morning is being Republic Day, but I've noticed on any holiday, the whole city is out on the streets. The Maidan is full, the Victoria Gardens. I've never seen this in other cities. People here like to go out when there's a holiday. So do I.
Yes, so thank you for forsaking lunch for this session. So typically we speak to Mr. Bond about the books he has written, but this time we are playing it a little differently, and he is a big fan of Agatha Christie in particular, but a huge number of women who wrote crime fiction in the early 20th century, and people of Mr. Bond's vintage, which is a good vintage, have very fond memories of reading Marjorie Allingham, Guy Marsh, P.D. James, and several others who wrote excellent crime fiction. Some of them have not stood the test of time, and perhaps that's why we call Christie the queen of crime, and her two major detectives, Mrs. Marple and Hercule Poirot, still capture the imagination of generations of readers. So which was the first Christie book? Let's start with Christie. Which was the first Christie book you read?
Oh, I must have been 10 years old. And I was a small boy sitting in a forest bungalow in the jungle outside Dehradun, and my mother and stepfather had gone off on a hunt. I wasn't particularly interested in hunts because they made me sit on an elephant, and twice I'd fallen off. So I decided I'd stay in this forest bungalow, and while I was there, nothing much happening, I discovered this old bookshelf. And that's where I had an introduction to several authors, among them and was Agatha Christie. And she kept me entertained for the few days I was in this lonely old dark bungalow. And the first Agatha Christie I read was called 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe. And it's one of those where I can't really remember the denouement, but I do recall it had something to do with a dentist who poisoned his patients by injecting them with cyanide instead of morphine. So Agatha Christie was, of course, very good with poisons. She had herself been a nurse. And poisoning seems to be a particularly British form of getting rid of people you want to do away with. In America, they use guns because guns are so easily available there. But guns aren't so easy to get in Europe and England. So you have to think of other methods of getting rid of your enemies. Huh? And poison was a popular one, not only in Agatha Christie's novels, but in the others that you mentioned too.
Yes, the British are nothing if they're not understated, so poison it has to be. And, you just mentioned that you don't remember how the story ended. But isn't that part of the charm of Christie? Now that you're a writer, the way she presents the whole case, there are various strands, not all of them to do with the murders per se. So, as somebody who was a young writer, what were the skills that you took on board from her?
Yes, she leads you on without creating the sort of suspense you'd get in a horror film or a modern mystery. But you want to keep going on because there are so many. It's like a maze in a way. She takes you down the wrong path very easily. And when I've often reread some of her early novels, and I usually go back to those where I've forgotten the denouement. Because otherwise, with the more famous ones like Murder on the Orient Express or And There Were None, or Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the end is so, it sticks in your mind so clearly that you won't have a surprise when you read them again. But it's interesting then to see how she works out her plot and misleads the reader in practically every novel of hers, especially those she wrote in the early years before and after 1920 and in the early 30s.
The other thing, staying with Christie, and then we'll go to the ones who are not as well remembered. We were discussing her books in, the Murder in Mesopotamia, Death on the Nile, when she was with her second husband, who was an archaeologist. Yes. So, the way she moved from the English countryside onto these, foreign locations and used them as part of the plot device. So, as an author, how do you think she managed to do that? And you can also talk us through the fact that you think there was one particular purple patch in her writing career. So the cases that you enjoyed from that period.
Yes, she was the novels you mentioned, which were set in the Middle East, which Murder in Mesopotamia, They Came to Baghdad, Death on the Nile, Appointment with Death was one I reread recently, which was very good. She was very much at ease in this milieu, with this background, because she would often accompany her husband on these archaeological expeditions. So they do provide also a contrast to her other books, which are either set in sleepy English villages, or maybe occasionally the French Riviera or a boat train, or in London where Mr. Hercule or Monsieur Hercule Poirot has his flat and his office. And I think, of course, Poirot was her greatest creation. And here we are about 75, 80 years after he first made his appearance. We still read Agatha Christie's novels, particularly the Poirot ones. And she has practically outsold, I think, every other writer. People say only the Bible has sold more than her. But the Bible is often given away free. And you have to buy an Agatha Christie still. So what's her secret? What's the charm then of an Agatha Christie book? Partly it's her skill in creating a plot, in leading you astray, in characterization too, because her characters, though two-dimensional, are still very strong and memorable. And also her style. Now, her style hasn't dated. Many writers over the years have been popular at times and then somehow go out of date or out of fashion. Often it's a case of style. But she has a very simple, direct, and lucid English style of writing, which makes her very readable. There's nothing fancy about it. She doesn't try to impress you with a lot of difficult language or witticisms which might be out of date. So it's very much a question of how she writes. And so she'd really, the only rival that Poirot or Miss Marple have had over the years would be Sherlock Holmes, of course. And there again, if you notice, why Conan Doyle's stories, how they've lasted so long is because of the central character of Holmes himself and Dr. Watson. I think a book lasts a long time if it has a very strong central character who is repeated again and again in subsequent books. So Poirot rivals Holmes, Captain Hastings, Poirot's sidekick, rivals Dr. Watson. Her other great creation was Miss Marple, the old lady, of course, who was also in her own way very entertaining, but quite different. And I think Agatha Christie preferred Miss Marple to Poirot because she even got rid of Poirot in a 1940 novel, but because the public would not have stood for it, she suppressed it and only published it 20 years later.
Okay. Now, there are other writers of that time who also created, detectives. There was P.D. James, as I mentioned, Guy Marsh. So they were extremely popular in their time. But what do you think, what prevented them from, why are they dated today? Why didn't they stand the test of time?
That's true, yes. Now, you don't see a Marjorie Allingham or Dorothy Sayers novel lying around as they did once. I think because here the characters have dated. Dorothy Sayers, her hero was an aristocratic Lord Peter Wimsey, who even had a Batman, and who spoke almost like a Woodhouseian character, without being funny like a Woodhouseian character. So you can't believe in a person like that. It's the same with Marjorie Allingham. She had a hero called Albert Campion, I think, who also spoke in a very upper class and rather falsetto voice. So Guy Marsh is still very readable because she had a believable detective inspector. And some of her novels were set in New Zealand and were very well written. And she could well make a comeback. But of the others, but then again, you look at the male detective writers of that period, and hardly any of them have survived. The best was probably John Dixon Carr, who was famous for his locked room mysteries. If you ever come across them, they're very readable.
Okay. Now, the other aspect which Mr. Bond loves talking about and has many theories about is the fact that Christie based many of her cases on real instances and real incidents and real murders. So if you can talk us through the Orient Express, as well as your theory about the mysterious affair at Styles.
Oh, yes. The Mysterious Affair at Styles was her first novel, I think 1916. Now, I live in Missouri, and over the years when I was doing some research into murders and mysteries that had taken place in hill stations back in the early 20th century, I came across the instance of a famous case in which an old lady living in the Savoy Hotel in Missouri had died of cyanide poisoning. And the suspicion had fallen on her lady companion, who at the time of the old lady's death was far away in Jhansi. She had an alibi. She'd been away for 3 or 4 days. Everyone was convinced, including the police, that the lady companion had committed the murder, had poisoned old Miss Garnet Orme, because Miss Garnet Orme had been under her influence, left her all her money in her will. And so they arrested the companion lady when she came back to Missouri, but they couldn't prove anything. So what their theory was, except that they didn't have the evidence for it, was that the cyanide had been put in the old lady's cough mixture bottle, and it had subsided and gone down to the bottom of the bottle, being heavier than the mixture. And that the old lady, the victim, had only come to the fatal dose after 2 or 3 days of it being put there. And after 2 or 3 days, when the companion lady was far away and had her alibi. And this case was widely reported, not only in India, but in England. And in fact, Rudyard Kipling, who was in India at the time, sent cuttings of it to his friend Conan Doyle. But Doyle didn't make use of it. Agatha Christie, I think, came across reports of the case because the plot of The Mysterious Affair at Styles parallels this particular murder which took place in Missouri. The cyanide in the cough mixture, the nurse companion being out of station with an alibi, and in the book, of course, she gets caught. But in reality, the nurse companion got away with it. The old lady's family came out from England, contested the will, and the will was cancelled due to undue influence, as they said in those days. But the murder charge couldn't be proved. So that particular murder went unsolved. But I have a feeling that since Doyle knew all about it, Agatha Christie might have known all about it too, and that she used it 2 or 3 years later, after this particular murder, as the plot for her very first novel, which was a great idea. That's not plagiarism, you know, you're fictionalizing an event in real life.
And what about Orient Express? How many of you know the original source of murder on the Orient Express?
You tell us, because you know
I'll
that.
tell the mirror cracked.
No, I don't know the Orient Express.
Okay, the Orient Express is, someone put up their hand, I think. How many know about the original source of the murder of the Orient? Okay, there are a couple of hands there. It was the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh. His son was kidnapped, and he was a 1-year-old child. It's a very grim tale, and there was a ransom asked for, and the case went horribly wrong, and the child died, and the nurse was in great anguish, and she was first suspected, and then the case went on, and she was acquitted, but that anguish stayed with her for a long time, and she was in the public eye for a long time, and that's the basis on which she built Murder on the Orient Express. And like in The Mysterious Affair of Styles, at Styles, she just used that as the base and then built the edifice of the story of Murder on the Orient Express. So you do learn things at Tata Steel Column. The other case is Mirror Cracked, the actress I told you about who you'd watched. What's her name?
Jean Tierney, the famous Hollywood actress, yes.
Yes. So a fan came and watched her, was a great fan of hers, and came to meet her when she had German measles. And the same story that pans out in the book took place, but of course she didn't murder the lady who infected her. So these were cases which Christie took on board and
made use of in her novels. Yes, how many did she write altogether? I think 80?
80,
about
around
80
yes.
detective novels over a long and fruitful writing career.
Yes.
But we mustn't forget that she was also a very successful playwright.
Of course.
And one of her plays, The Mousetrap, ran in London for, I think, over 50 years.
Yes.
And there were others too, like Witness for the Prosecution, which was filmed with Marlene Dietrich and Charles Lawton as the judge, and Tyrone Power. as he turns out to be the murderer. Um, a number of her novels made excellent films. Some of the Death on the Nile, and some of the Miss Marple stories too. Um, so I think that too helped a lot in ensuring her the fact that she's remembered so long.
Yes, I was just going to come to the films. So, what makes your films too are now? Your stories are also being filmed now, and we are going to see them on Z5, which is the web stream that has rights to many of your stories. So, what makes Christie's stories, or in general, why is it so easy and so visual? These stories to even today. There was a Murder on the Orient Express, which released last year, for instance.
Again, I think character, the character of Hercule Poirot, because he's eccentric, he's larger than life, and he's memorable. So, if you go through English literature, you'll find that many great novels are remembered because of the largeness, the larger than life characters that make them famous. Pickwick and Mr. Pickwick, Huckleberry Finn and Huckleberry Finn, and you can just carry on like that.
Wuthering Heights.
Sherlock Holmes in the Holmes stories. A lot of people confused Holmes with the author himself. So I think very often it's the central character who has to be memorable in some way, and of course have to be an astute detective. And I think in that respect, Poirot sort of overshadowed other detectives in this field.
Okay. Now, before I throw it open, I have to ask you about your own writings. You've created Mrs. Ripley Bean, for instance. So, how do you create such a character?
I'd love to do a detective story or create such a character, but I tried once, and I wrote a story, I think, Who Killed the Rani? And friends read it and said, but we guessed the villain in the very first chapter. So I'm afraid I wasn't very good at it. So I think I do a little better with ghosts, because ghost stories you can get away with practically anything, you see. So, a few of them, as you mentioned, are being filmed as on Netflix, and which is
Z5. That's the channel.
You see, I'm technologically totally ignorant. I'll never see these films because I don't have all these gadgets.
We shall go up to the hills and organize all of this.
You see them and tell me about them if they're any good, because I see real ghosts. I don't have to see them on the screen. Thank you.
But there is a commonality between writing these spooky tales, your ghost stories, and crime fiction.
Well, Agatha Christie wrote a number of supernatural novels and tales. It often turns out in them that they weren't ghosts at all, but she has that supernatural element there in.
So you do require the similar skill of having to keep the audience's attention, keeping them guessing, throwing the odd red herring.
Yes, it must be a bit different. You have to be a bit original, and you can't have all ghosts doing the same thing. I personally haven't seen a ghost, though I hear them from time to time. There's this. I live in a very old cottage, and my bedroom adjoins a small sitting room where nobody sleeps at night, and Rakesh and Beena sleep at the other end of the flat. But very often, in the middle of the night, I hear voices. I hear people talking, and they're not quarreling. They're not excited. They're just having a normal conversation. Several people, and I can't make out what they're saying, but they're just probably having a tea party. And I get up, switch on the lights, and of course there's nobody there. Then I go back to bed. I try to sleep, not very successfully. Then I'm aware of somebody tucking in my blankets and trying to keep me warm.
It's a friendly ghost.
Switch on the light, nobody there. So a very maternal and motherly ghost. So I don't mind, and I have no objections at all. That's why my ghosts are also pretty gentle and harmless. And I had a complaint from a little girl who 8 or 9 years old. She came up to me and said, "Sir, I like your ghost stories, but they're not scary enough." She said, "Can't you make them more frightening?" So I said, "I can't, but if you go and watch TV every evening, there's lots of horror on it. You can enjoy that too."
So I was going to ask you, since you've read extensively, if you go to Mr. Bond's house, it's this dreamy little cottage, and then he'll tell you to take a seat. So you have to remove one pile of books from a chair and sit on it. So he defines the term voracious reader. So in all the spooky and ghostly stories you've read, is there any one that really scared you?
Going back over the years, probably the ones I read as a boy, I discovered ghost stories again in that same forest dark bungalow where I found Agatha Christie's One to Buckle My Shoe. And it was a book called Ghost Stories of an Antiquary by M.R. James. And he was a pioneer in this particular field of writing. And a lot of his stories had a sort of academic background because he was a professor at Oxford. And so he just wrote 2 or 3 collections of ghost stories, but they were very good. He doesn't go out of his way to scare you, but there's just something uncanny or sinister under the surface, you see. So I think the most effective ghost stories are not those in which, sudden apparitions come down and give you a heart attack, but things that you might take for granted and then realize that perhaps they're not what they seem. So M.R. James was there, and then Algernon Blackwood, and then Walter de la Mare, who also got ghosts into his poems, and so on over the years. It's quite. Edgar Allan Poe wrote. Edgar Allan Poe, yes, he's there. The ghost stories merge into horror stories too, because Poe was an alcoholic and on drugs, and he got these strange visions. And in fact, I think he used to even fall in love with dying women and jump into the grave after them when they were being buried. Quite crazy, but a genius all the same.
And among your own stories, ghost stories, is there any one that you think is very popular and that you're particularly fond of?
I can't think of them. Well, there's one that's appeared in the school curriculum over the years, just a 2-page story, A Face in the Dark, in which a school teacher is walking home late at night in a hill station, Simla or Missouri, and he finds a small boy sitting at the roadside on a parapet, weeping bitterly, and he, with his face hidden in his hands, and Mr. Oliver, the schoolmaster, taps him on the shoulder and says, "What's wrong, son? What's troubling you?" And the boy looks up, and he has no eyes, no nose, no face, just a faceless head without any features. And Mr. Oliver gets terrified, and he runs into the school, through the school gate, and there's a chokidar coming along with his lamp. And Mr. Oliver says to the chokidar, "There's this boy outside the gate, and he has no face." And the chokidar says, "Was he like this, Sahab?" And he raised the lamp to his own face, and he had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no features at all. That's when Mr. Oliver had his heart attack. That was it.
So on that note, perhaps we can take a couple of questions from the audience. You can raise your hand. It'll take a couple of seconds for the mic to, I think, come to you.
Tell us about your own ghost stories, your own experiences.
So we'll start from the front so that, can you raise your hand if you have a story? Okay. There's one girl there. Maybe you can shout it till we get a mic to you. Yes. Yes, ask. Is Mrs. Ripley being inspired by Miss Marple?
Not exactly inspired. You mentioned Miss Ripley Bean, an old lady who I wrote about in 5 or 6 stories in a book called Death Under the Deodars. Now, she's a bit similar to Miss Marple, but the Ripley Bean I write about was very real. She had this cottage with me in the hills when I first came there. And she used to tell me a lot of stories about the past. Huh? And I've used her in a couple of stories. So there is a resemblance there, but she's not, Miss Ripley Bean is not a detective. She's simply telling me stories about murders and mysteries that have taken place over the years.
Okay.
Miss Marple, we haven't spoken much about, but she was also, I think, almost as popular as Hercule Poirot. And my favorite Marple book is called Murder at the Vicarage, which is a very funny one. In this, Agatha Christie displays her sense of humor because the vicar tells the story and he's a sort of absent-minded old man who keeps bumbling along. And it's really quite funny.
Yes, and I think Bengali cinema audiences are also familiar with a particular Miss Marple story, which we mentioned earlier, which is A Mirror Cracked, which was then adapted into Shubho Mahurat by Rituparno Ghosh. And the eminent actress Rakhi Gulzar played Miss Marple, while the film star was played by Sharmila Tagore. So, yes, there are Miss Marple stories that have been adapted here as well. There's a hand there. Does anyone have the mic? Oh, there, yes.
What about the detectives Tommy and Tuppence? I think they are quite an interesting couple.
Yes, they are. There are just, I think, 4 or 5 Tommy and Tuppence novels.
Partners in Crime.
Yes, and one I read at school, the first one, I think. N.R.M. Partners in Crime, that's Malavika and me up here. That's another title. And the last one she did later in the 1970s, I think her powers as a writer were flagging a bit because the last one wasn't all that good.
Postern of Fate.
Yes, Postern of Fate. And it got mixed up with sort of spies, and it wasn't very convincing. Another one that didn't quite come off was Passenger at Frankfurt, which by then I think age was beginning to tell, and she wasn't at her very best. But otherwise, I think through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, she was brilliant.
Okay. Let's come here first, then I'll take those as well.
Sir, would you tell what do you feel, what is your viewpoint regarding Then There Were None?
And Then There Were None, which was originally released as 10 Little Niggers.
Its title changed several times.
Several times, and Indians. And
but I think people naturally objected to the title 10 Little Niggers. So it was changed to 10 Little Indians. People objected to that. Then it became, and then there were none. I don't suppose anyone could object to that.
Yes. That's called the euphemism treadmill, because what is not acceptable keeps changing. So at one point it was niggers, then it became Indians. So you're constantly, improving your political correctness.
But you liked using nursery rhymes as her titles, didn't she? There's A Pocketful of Rye, and then there were none. Then there's, think of others that were nursery rhymes. Hickory Dickory Dock, wasn't there? Three Blind Mice, I'm sure. I'm not
Three Blind Mice was part of the plot in
Five Little Pigs.
Five Little Pigs, and also literary ones, The Mirror Cracked, By the Pricking of My Thumbs. So, yes, she used a lot of allusions.
Well, One, Two, Buckle My Shoe.
One, Two, Buckle My Shoe. By the Pricking of My Thumbs is from Macbeth, for instance. The Ed Hardy Boy.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bond. Welcome to Kolkata. I wanted to ask you, have you ever had a part to play in an actual mystery?
A part to play, you mean in a film or in a real mystery?
No, I mean a real mystery. where you took part or oversaw it all?
Where I got rid of somebody and got away with it. No, I can't tell you if I did. Thank you. No, I don't think I've played not that I can think of straight off. I'll tell you this, the old lady, when Miss Bean, when I wrote about, when she died, when she passed away, she was alone and I was alone in the house. So I decided I should sit there in her room and just keep her company till morning until other people came. And she was laid out, she was no longer alive. And I was sitting there and the night drew on. The moon came up over the mountains and it shone through the window, it was summer, to the open window, onto her bed. It started moving up across her bed and onto her face. And while the moonlight was on her face and everything there, she began to smile. And I got so terrified, I really got scared. You know, this old lady had been dead for hours and now I was sitting there and she was smiling and this smile turned into a wide grin. And just as I was about to get up and run out for help, with a bang, out popped her false teeth. You see, so the rigor mortis was setting in, and the contraction of the muscles, her teeth hadn't been removed, and the teeth shot out, and I shot out of the room too, and departed.
Okay, this girl in front, yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Regarding detective novels, did you ever read Kolkata's own Feluda by Satyajit Ray?
I'd read some of his stories. I'd read his ghost stories. Feluda, I don't think, no, I didn't read many, but some were filmed. I remember seeing some of them as television films.
Okay. There's a question at the back. Did you finally get a mic?
I've got a mic. I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Bond, why is the policeman always the buffoon in detective stories? Do you have an opinion on that?
I guess it's because readers like to. I think the average person has some sort of ingrained resentment against policemen at large, and so the writer panders maybe to that and makes them rather silly. Although there have been clever police detectives too, like Inspector Alain, Nagayo Marshes, and good old Superintendent Battle in the Agatha Christie novels. He's not too bad. He's rather has a wooden face and without any expression. He's rather dull, but he plods along. But you're right. Most thriller writers and detective story writers do seem to depict policemen as buffoons, which they are not by any stretch of imagination.
Okay, I can take two more questions. We have a little surprise at the end of the session. So I will go to this lady only because she's wearing a stylish hat.
Mr. Bond, good afternoon.
Where's the stylish hat?
There, right in front.
Okay. Thank you.
In all your years of traveling through the hills as a young boy or even throughout your life, did you have any paranormal encounter anywhere, any supernatural encounter in Shimla, for example?
Not really, to be honest. I can't say I believe in ghosts, but I do see them from time to time. And some of them wear funny hats. But you're very real and substantial, I can tell.
So there's one person who's been patiently waiting at the back for a mic. You won't be able to see him. He's just exactly at your blind spot. A ghostly voice for you. Yes.
Mr. Bond, what do you make out of Agatha Christie's character Ariadne Oliver? Do you think it's based on...
Oh, yes, that's another interesting character, Mrs. Oliver. I think it's a self-portrait in a way. And I did read somewhere that she was sort of caricaturing herself in her portrayal of Mrs. Oliver, who is a friend of Hercule Poirot and helps confuse the trail when he's investigating a case. But so I think it's Agatha Christie herself.
Okay, one girl's got the mic. Small, quick question, quick answer, and then, as I said, I have a surprise.
Sir,
Yes, she's there in the red t-shirt.
I wanted to ask you as a writer, have you ever had problem writing your stories, like you ever sat back in your chair and you said that this writing business is delightful, isn't it?
Have I ever had a problem as a writer? No, not really. Sometimes the problems over the years might have been financial, but not the writing itself wasn't a problem. No.
Okay. I'm afraid we are really out of time, and I said I have a little surprise for all of you. As I mentioned briefly around in the middle of the session, some of, like Christie's novels, some of Mr. Bond's stories have made it to Z5, which we will now promise to install in Mr. Bond's house. And I'd like to invite one of the directors who's worked on Mr. Bond's, one of Mr. Bond's story in the Parchai series of stories that Z5 is doing. So I'd like to invite Anirudh Roy Chaudhary and Raima Sen, who features in one of the stories that have been have been made into an episode of this series. And perhaps they could say a couple of words to you, and then we'll show you one of the trailers so that between two literary meets, you still have a bit of Mr. Bond with you.
Hi, sir. I wanted to go to Nile and wait here, but we ended up shooting.
Tony, I'm not talking.
Sorry, we were shooting for the last 1 month in Shimla, and my voice has gone for a toss. And indeed, it's a privilege to do Mr. Bond stories, ghost stories. Raima will launch the trailer along with Sir. And I wanted to do a ghost story, but ended up making a love story. Thanks. It's called Overcoat.
So I think we can show the trailer for Overcoat. Is it ready? No, it's all right, you're fine. This one and this one, there are two. Yes, we might be coming in the way.
अब हवा के किसी झोंके की तरह हवा को कोई कैसे कैद करे? चुप रहने दो। इस बहाने एक बार फिर मुलाकात हो जाएगी।
Let's hold hands.
So what better way to celebrate Valentine's Day than with Mr. Bond and a really scary story? So any thoughts on Overcoat?
Yes, it's a very short story, but they would have had to fill out and I think develop the relationship between the narrator and the girl he meets on his way to an evening party. So it's, as in the case of 2 or 3 of the other stories, which are very short, a certain amount of filling out and adaptation has to be done. And I'm sure it's been done very well.
Okay, and yes. So finally, this is the last of Mr. Bond at the Victoria Memorial. But now we are taking him to the South Park Street Cemetery, and only those with passes will be allowed in. I'm making this announcement so that there is not any chaos or disappointment at the gates of the cemetery. That's not a place for being disappointed for this, so I don't want that to happen.
This is where I get nervous.
So thank you, Mr. Bond. May we always have you at this venue at this time on Republic Day. And thank you, Raima, for your charming presence. You didn't want to speak, I didn't make you. Your smile is enough. And Aniruddha, anything else you'd like to add?
No, it's I have done one more stories. It's Wilson Bridge. And there are 12 stories which are, I have invited national award-winning directors across the country, and they're doing those. And I must thank very Shomita from Allcap for writing both the stories. I mean, writing means to adapting for screenplay. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll just get the stage ready for the next session. Mr. Bond will only sign the first 50 or 75 books. Everybody, just one book, please. He's not had lunch, and we have to be kind to him, otherwise he won't come back.
All book signings at the bookstore, please. Mr. Bond will not sign any scraps of paper or autograph books.